In preparation this week, I have been following this series of lessons that I've been using on Jesus's deeds and teachings. And knowing this morning I was going to speak on gratitude, I thought, well, I've surely Jesus taught gratitude. So I really need to look up what Jesus taught on gratitude or thanksgiving and teach on that. I don't know, have any of you done that? Done Google or concordance search? What Jesus taught on gratitude? I did. It came up empty. So I took my Bible. I have a book entitled What Jesus Taught, and it has just about every topic he touched on. It's about that thick, and go through it. I looked up gratitude, and, well, it wasn't in there. I didn't look it up. I looked for it, and it wasn't there. And so I thought I was almost done. But a thought occurred to me, and I don't know if you knew this or not, or maybe I'll ask a question. How many times did Jesus talk about grace? Or let me be more specific. How many times did Jesus use the word grace? And you all are correct. That's how many times? None. But it's obvious when you look at the life of Christ that he taught on grace. In fact, his life itself and his death was about grace and was graceful. And such is the case with the topic of gratitude as well. And we're going to be in a few minutes in Luke, the 17th chapter, and we're going to look at verses 11 through 19. And what takes place in this passage is that Jesus heals the 10 lepers. And you might be familiar with the story that 10 are healed and only one returns to give him thanks for healing him. And Jesus had some interesting comments on what takes place. And I think there's a lot of interesting things that take place that really teach us a lot about gratitude right here along with these concepts. So as a form of introduction, and I'll be repeating this in just a moment, but when we look and drop ourselves into Luke the 17th chapter, what we see in Jesus' life is he's busy. In fact, that's the understatement of the night. I know it's early yet, but there won't be an understatement that compares with that idea. In fact, he's on his way to Jerusalem for Passover. But it's not just any Passover, because there's literally 1 million people or more heading to Jerusalem for Passover. But it is different for Jesus because it's his last trip to Jerusalem. And he's got all these things on his mind. He's got all these things to do. And it's interesting to me to see what Jesus does on his way to Jerusalem. Because I am task-oriented enough that when I get onto a task and I'm trying to accomplish something, I'm very prone to overlooking people, or worse yet, being snappy with people. I mean, not Amanda, but other people, being snappy or ignoring their needs. And one of the beautiful things about Jesus is even when he is busy, when he's got the whole world on his shoulders, he's seeing needs, he's healing needs, he's helping people, he's showing compassion, he's teaching about gratitude. The other thing that I think is just so much of a standout that I need to mention it in an introduction is that we're going to see people who are a long ways off. And the significance of that is these are the people who get ignored. You don't even have to be busy to ignore people who are a long ways off. And Jesus knows their needs, and he meets their needs. We'll draw a few more applications from that message in a few more moments. But I think it's worth noting that no matter where you are, Jesus knows where you are. He knows what your needs are, and He's able to meet your needs. These are the people everyone else overlooked. So with that in mind, we are going to turn to Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, and verse 13 that David mistakenly read so well for us. And this is the passage for those of you that haven't been with us on a regular basis on Sunday nights. This is the text that will kind of summarize everything that we look at tonight. And David read this idea from verses 11 through 18 that bring out the concept that we Gentiles were separated from Christ. In fact, verses 11 and 12 comment on this. Therefore, remember that at what times you Gentiles in the flesh called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, that's the Jews, which is made by the flesh by hands. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Now, just in case you missed it, what Paul says is you're in bad shape. And you're a long ways off from God. But verse 13 is our golden text, if you would look at it with me. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. We were a long ways off from God. And Jesus brought us near. Jesus brought us close to God. Now, David went on to read that He didn't just bring us close, that He gave us access to God. Now, come Thursday, it's going to be a really important thing to know Chris. Because that's where all the good food is in our family, Thursday. Not because Chris made it, but that's where it's at. And what we see about Jesus is He's taken these people, you and I, who are strangers, who are aliens, who have no rightful call or right, if you will, to the blessings that are in God. Then get serious. He says, without hope, without God. And He pulls us in close, and He gives us access to the greatest blessings. It's good for me to know about me. And I think the underlying message as we go throughout tonight is that I need to be looking and understanding and patient with people who are far off. I think it's a common trait within religion. It was in Jesus' time, and I believe it is with us today, to expect people to come to what's right and then find God. That's just not what we see, and I'm grateful that that's not the God we serve. God has met us where we were and enabled us to come close, giving us access to the Father. I used to get so nervous sitting down to study the gospel with someone. And there's a reason to get nervous. It's serious stuff. It's got more than lifelong consequences. And I still get a little nervous about that, but I don't get near as nervous as I used to. Because most of what I used to study, most of what I used to feel obligated to point out, isn't good news at all. It's not part of the gospel. I thought I had to tell people exactly everything they were wrong on. We didn't have time to talk about me. We were talking about their faults and their problems and their mistakes. I've sat in a lot of studies with other teachers and helped them. They did it. I've watched them, and they've watched me do it. And then sometimes you walk away and say, well, the gospel's offensive. That's why, now that person's just offended at me. That's what they were really offended at. The gospel's good news. This morning we looked at Mark 1:1 as we closed our lesson, that the good news of the real king and what all that role is going to mean. Isn't it interesting as we get to Mark 16, the end of that book, that's what Jesus is saying, you go and proclaim to the whole world the good news. And I am grateful that I have the good news that Jesus came and paid the price for my sins. I am grateful that He gave me access to the Father. I am grateful that He's helped make me what I am to the extent that I am any good. And I didn't have to be good before I could measure up. If you would then turn your Bibles back to Luke, the 17th chapter. We're going to look at this healing of the 10 lepers. We're going to start with 11 through 14. I have 14a up because we're going to break 14 up with some of what we're dealing with here tonight. But starting in verse 11, on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee, and as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers, who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he said to them, go and show yourselves to the priests. And they went and were cleansed. He was on his way to Jerusalem. I mentioned earlier what all had to be on Jesus' mind. Not to mention he's teaching his disciples, and can you imagine you're on your way to Jerusalem as Jesus, you're going to give your life, you've got to go through all the trials that are taking place, and you have 12 men with you whom you've been teaching for 3 years. And what they've been fighting over recently and what they are going to fight about at the Last Supper, when you are saying, listen, the Passover feast has really been about me the whole time and I'm going to have to give my life. They're going to be sitting across the table from you arguing about something worse than politics. Right? About who's going to be the greatest. No, it was just about politics, wasn't it? Where they were going to fit into the kingdom. That's how much these individuals have a grasp on the kingdom that you're giving your life to set up for. You see Jesus in these last days on the way to Jerusalem, kind of ramping up his teaching, if you will. And if you're in chapter 17, verse 5, I think the apostles are starting to get the message that it's time to step up the game, because they look at him and they say to him, increase our faith. I think they're asking for what I want as a general rule. Just increase my faith, Lord. Make it happen. Bless me with it. I don't want to do all the hard work. Just give it to me. What's he notice? All this going on. You'll remember from a few weeks ago, chapter 19, he sees a little man up in a tree. He's still on his way to Jerusalem. Here, there's men afar off crying out to him. I think for the first time in our lives, in the last year and a half, 2 years now, we're starting to understand what leprosy was like. I mentioned a fair number of our people from this congregation are currently in quarantine. In months past, we've had probably half of us here have been in quarantine or something along those lines throughout the last couple months. Now, the quarantine, what is it, 10 days now? It's hard to keep track of. 10 days, someone says. It used to be 14, right? 14 days. leprosy, these people were quarantined, period. You get the point? They didn't get out of quarantine in most cases. They were quarantined until they were cleansed, and there was no cure for leprosy. And so they were just quarantined. And so these people left their families, these people left their jobs, these people left their lives, and they lived in leper colonies where there was no hope. And they were a long ways off. Talk about being a long ways off from God. They couldn't go to the temple. They weren't on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover. And Jesus notices them. But notice this about these lepers. We're going to see in a few moments that they have some big differences between them. At least one of them, and most scholars or most commentators anyhow, think that there were 9 Jews and 1 Samaritan. I think that's a little bit of an assumption. What we know is there's at least 1 Samaritan. But in all probability, there is Jews and Samaritans. One of the interesting things to me about Scripture that David read, and it's brought out all throughout the New Testament, is that God, that Paul in Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, is talking about uniting the Gentiles and the Jews. There could not have been a bigger divide between those two people. We talk about divides today in terms of cultural divides, and there are cultural divides. These people had cultural divides. We talk today in terms of divides in terms of politics. I know it's hard for us to imagine, but their politics couldn't have been any further apart from one another. These individuals were divided by race. We still have this problem today. These people couldn't have been further divided by race, Gentiles and Jews, than what they were. And yet, the whole message is I've made one person. Now, let me make some assumptions about these individuals. You think some of them likely prior to leprosy were rich and some poor? Likely. Do you think some were likely male and some female? Likely. Do you think that some were old and some were young? Likely. Why isn't any of this mentioned? It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You see, in Jesus' eyes, there were 2 types of people. The lost and the saved. In fact, brethren, we would do well to remember that without Jesus, we're all lost. The only reason there's a difference between the lost and the saved is because of Jesus. Because of the path that He made available. Jesus looked up and He noticed where they were and what their need was. I put this quote up here. The source is still on it. I know nothing about this website, but I thought it was a great quote. See needs and meet them. See needs and meet them. Isn't that what Jesus does? Isn't that what He did? Think about what we see when we see people. We see differences, all the categories we talked about. We see problems. We see faults, I mean to say. That person does this or that. That person has that problem. And the worst sin is the sin that's different than mine. Jesus saw needs. Jesus saw their needs. If you would, note again verse 14. When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. Now, this verse is kind of easy to overlook. In fact, let me ask this question, and I'm fully intent on you answering it wrong. So when you answer this, be willing to be wrong and understand that's part of the process. What's so amazing about this verse? I'll read it again while you think about it. When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were cleansed. What's amazing about that verse? Anna, do tell. They got healed. Exactly. Boy, this crushes me. That's... Okay, you gotta be tough. That's the exact wrong answer that I was looking for. I was really hoping Chris would answer that. No, honey, you're right in a sense. That's amazing. It's a miracle, right? There was no cure, and they're healed. There's something I think equally amazing about this. Ask yourself, number one, we talked about the fact that Jesus sees these people. Everyone else is overlooking. Everyone else is meant to overlook and to stay away from. And he says, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." Why? What's he talking about? Well, I mentioned that quarantine. And because there was no cure for leprosy, the vast majority never got out of it. However, any skin disease was labeled as leprosy. They didn't have microscopes then or a real good understanding of microbes and different kinds of little beasts that live on and in our skin and all that good thing. And so if you had something categorized as leprosy, and think about this, you went to a leper colony, so if you didn't have the bad leprosy, you soon got it, I'm sure. But if by some slim chance you got over your ailment, here's how you got better. Or, excuse me, here's how you were released from quarantine. You went and you showed yourself to the priest and said, "Look! I am all better now. That rash, it's gone." And so, Stephanie, Russ, you got a negative test. And you were released. Now, what's the problem with this? Jesus says, "Go show yourself to the priest." What's their problem? They hadn't shown themselves, but they got a bigger problem, don't they? They're still sick. Oops. They're still sick. Jesus says, "Go show yourself to the priest." They were going to get inspected. I look at my arms, I say, wait, why would I go to the priest? This is like trying to go through one of those health checks and you have a fever of 104. Why would I go submit to the health check to try to get through the gate when I'm sick? And they went. How many of them went? 10. 10. Is that faith? Better believe it. Better believe it. All 10 of them went. And notice the end of verse 14. And as they went, they were cleansed. Along the way. We'll come back to that in a few moments. If you would, look at the connection between faith and gratitude. verses 15 through 19. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Were all the 9? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except the foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Your faith has made you well. I want you to think about this, because for me, this gives me cause for pause. What did Jesus tell them to do? Go to the priest. What are the 9 doing? Going to the priest. Notice the timing of when they were cleansed and when Jesus commends this man. This man, again, verse 15, as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw he was healed, turned back. Turned back from where? Going to the priest. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Are you telling me that Jesus rewarded disobedience? That's not the point. But I do note this, that the 9 were doing what Jesus told them to do, and yet were rebuked. Why? They'd missed the whole point. They'd missed the whole point. Makes me think of 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter. You know, we read this at so many funerals that I think we just completely miss the point, don't we? If you would, read with me the first 3 verses. "If I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, if I deliver up my body to be burned and have not love, I have nothing." You see, this individual was overcome with gratitude. I noted this morning. There's a difference between joy and gratitude. Do you think all 10 were joyful? I'd bank on it. They were all joyful. That's not gratitude, is it? This individual showed gratitude. Jesus in Matthew the 23rd chapter, he says, "Woe to you Pharisees and scribes, you hypocrites," over and over and over and over again. You see, these were the people who understood really well who was excluded. They understood really well who wasn't allowed at the temple. They understood really well what everyone else was doing wrong. And they weren't showing a lick of gratitude to Jesus. Well, I want to be clear, because I made the point that I believe that Jesus rewarded disobedience. That's not completely true. I will guarantee this man turned after expressing his gratitude and his praise to God and went to the priest. Everything about the context would suggest that that's what happens. But he understood what Jesus had already taught. On the way to the task, he paused for people. He paused to meet needs. He paused to express his love and to give his gratitude. I will leave you with these points to put in your doggy bag and take home and devour later. They were healed as they went. Jesus says to the Samaritan who comes back, your faith has made you whole. He's not talking about health. He's saying your faith has healed you in ways that the other 9 have not yet obtained. Because they were physically healed too. As they went. That's like Jesus telling you to write out a $100 check with no money in your account. I once saw Chris expecting a money order, having written out $270,000 out of his bank hire. What was it, Chris? $340,000 he wrote out of his bank account for someone else. And I was driving with him the next day, and he kept looking. He's waiting for the wire transfer to cover that. Because it turns out, a bum like Chris doesn't have $340,000 in his bank account. Can you believe that? But he says, Mike, what happens if this wire transfer doesn't come through? I said, for a check that size, they throw you in jail. He is sweating it. But you think, certainly he'll throw you in jail. Man, he was nervous. He's checking his phone. Now imagine this. Jesus says, write the check out for $100 and you don't have a penny in your account. That's what these men did. That's what these lepers did. It's kind of like telling you to start your car when you know the battery's dead. You know, Bob, you've been out there and you've cranked. It wouldn't start because battery was too low. And then you finally got to the point you don't even hear the click anymore. You know? And you're stepping outside your car and Jesus says, hey, get in your car and start it up. It's time to go home. You know the battery's dead. Get this. It's like Jesus telling you to feed 5,000. Don't try this, Brittany. Like telling you to feed 5,000 when you have no more than 2 biscuits and 2 sardines. What's your response? Would you put the check back in your pocket and walk home broke? Would you go down the road and hitchhike, leaving the car sit along the road? Would you eat the 2 biscuits and 2 sardines and say, boy, I wish someone would do something about this hunger problem? What would you do? He says, go into all the world and proclaim that good news. We're not going to sit and complain about culture. We're not going to sit and think about all the obstacles. They were healed as they went. They started out diseased and they ended up whole, complete, and perfect. Verse 16 says, whoever believes and is baptized shall be saved. Whoever believes not, damned. What will we do? What will you do? If we can help you to meet those spiritual needs, whether it's in knowledge or action, I encourage you to make that known as together we stand and sing.